To
This
talk to
conference will now be recorded.
it's a real privilege to be invited to talk to the P-Way Institute, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity. I'm unlikely to get too technical. There may be some bits that are, and you'll have to forgive me for the very sort of geotechnical slant, as is revealed on this slide. I've been working in geotechnical engineering primarily. I'm a chartered geologist, worked in geotechnical contracting, but that was mainly ground investigation for about 7 years, then moved across to consultancy. But with the last 3 years of consultancy with Atkins Rail, I've got a total of 22 years of experience now working on the railway in geotechnics. Up until around about 2014, when I went to my boss and said, we need a team that really focuses on drainage and line side activities. And she said yes, and that is what I've been doing for the past 6 years. We've recently reorganised, as many of you will know, and now I'm part of the regional team in North West and Central, which effectively provides a sort of technical authority type of structure to set standards, look at strategy, assure process, and just make sure that the business is moving in the direction that the executive want it to move, and to provide a linkage with the overall technical authority at HQ or centre at Milton Keynes. We're all bedding in rather, and it's an interesting time, shall we say? But things seem to be moving in the right direction. So I'll press on. I may rattle through quite a few of the slides, which are more images, because I've got rather a lot of slides, which is a usual mistake, and I do tend to waffle on a bit. So I'll try and get through these as quickly as I can. Adverse or extreme weather, what do we mean? Well, it's anything that's out of the ordinary. Obviously, you know, it's obvious to everybody. It's things like high wind speeds, temperature extremes, rainfall, fog, lightning strikes. And we'll all be well aware of the impacts that these adverse or extreme weather conditions have. High seas and overtopping, snow and frost, heat impacts, flooding and scour, earthworks failures, drainage washout, that, you know, they'll all be familiar. You know, just to remind those who perhaps might have been in Saudi Arabia for the past 5 years, this is Dawlish Warren, the sort of overtopping that we get actually on the Cumbrian coast on North West and Central, and I'm sure the Wales route participants will be aware of issues on coastal railway as well. This is a rather bizarre thing, which looks as though it should probably more likely be on the cover of a 1970s rock album or possibly a science fiction book. This is at Cheddington on the West Coast Main Line, when a couple of containers were literally blown off the top of a train as it travelled over a fairly high embankment, but a most bizarre sight. Winter Wonderland, I think somewhere in Scotland. This was a buckle that actually happened on the MCJ line near Calvert Junction, the old Grand Central route, I believe. Somebody will correct me if that's wrong, but this happened in August this year. Fairly poor quality image, but it was taken off a forward-facing CCTV camera, I believe. Lovely shap cutting. I hasten to add, before we did the drainage works there. We very rarely have flooding there now, but that's an aqueduct going over the railway at that location right at the top of the picture, and a very big catchment on the right hand side there, but you know, one of the high points on the railway. Fenny Compton cutting on the DCL line was a source of frequent flooding. This is an old picture. The sharp-eyed among you will notice that the person on the left is not wearing full PPE. I hasten to add, it is an old picture, but caused us lots of problems for a very long period of time. This is the River Coldew in Carlisle. I believe this was at the time of Storm Desmond, December 2015, but it washed away the retaining structure along the River Coldew, which is flowing towards you in that picture, and caused no end of nuisance during Storm Desmond, including flooding the whole of the track on the approaches to the viaduct over the Eden, further to the north. Interestingly, and as a bit of an aside, we repaired the boundary wall, which I think you can see just in the distance there. It's just a wall at the top of the retaining structure, and the EA got quite miffed with us because the gap in the wall that was there beforehand was actually a critical flow relief path for their flood model for Carlisle. We just thought the wall had fallen down, but they'd actually built it into their model to minimise flood risk in Carlisle. And actually, when we restored the wall, it made the flooding worse in the town. So there you go. Just shows how little we know about the detail of these things. This is a random structure in Scotland. There was fairly severe flooding on one of the on one of the Highland lines, and it removed part of the bridge abutment and an unspecified tunnel portal in the southeast, showing fairly severe erosion of loose granular materials at a tunnel portal, which led to a flow of debris onto the track down below. Again, the keen-eyed will spot the third rail. And a final photo in this series of a number of failures on a cutting slope, again up in Scotland, following very severe weather quite some years back. I'm including these because I think it's really important, and given the title of the talk, I'm obviously focusing on adverse weather and its impact on drainage, and that really means rainfall. But I think it's really important to understand why water has such a bad impact on our assets. Those of you who are P-way engineers will understand the impact the water has on track formation, not just in flooding, but obviously formation issues and wet beds and so on. There is a big chunk of this talk, which I make no apology for, I'm a geotechnical engineer after all, which relates to the impacts that water have on earthwork assets. So apologies if it's not focused on P-way, but I think from our point of view, drainage is a system and it serves all parts of the railway assets. And I think it's really important that we bear that in mind as we consider the impacts of weather. So to move on, just a bit of an overview showing the impacts that water has. We have wind having the biggest single impact, but when you consider the combined effects of snow as well as flooding, and also the impacts of the lack of water due to heat and its impact on earthworks, more of that later, a substantial proportion of the weather-related delay minutes are due to the impacts of water in whatever form it arrives on the railway and on the network. So it is a very significant thing, effective management is particularly important, obviously. So I just, in this title, stressed the fact that this is an integrated system. And I think the pictures, these two pictures that I've got here, help to illustrate it. Both of these images they're not images of the North Portal of Helm Tunnel on the Settle in Carlisle, although they do look a little bit like it. But they are actually taken from our Network Rail how-to guides. And these are a really good resource. And if anybody is on the call who works for Network Rail, and well, in fact, you don't need to work for Network Rail because they're all available via YouTube. If you've not seen them, they are a really good primer and a really good introduction to drainage systems, drainage inspection, the Network Rail approach. They're tied into the latest version of the standards. And there are each video is around about 10 minutes, and it provides you with a useful guide to the sorts of assets that we're looking at. But I just really want to stress in this picture the fact that this is a system, from the water coming in the inflows on the top right hand side, or the channel in the center right. We are managing water from third party land across our asset and to an outfall. A lot of that water is reliant on travelling through the track drainage system, but the track drainage system needs to have the capability of accepting water from off track and delivering water effectively and a non-destructive way to an outfall at a sensible location. And I think, you know, I really would like to stress the importance of the system approach. Structural engineers will be interested in the management of drainage across tunnel portals or around in the formation where it crosses an underbridge. P-way engineers will be interested in the effective management of water off over bridges down onto the track, and so it goes on. So it's very hard to just consider the drainage for one part of the asset groups in isolation. And you know, if there's one message you go away from this talk with, is that drainage is a system, and we need to manage it as a system, and that is, you know, a really important message to get across to everybody in the business. Just a bit of detail on how water affects earthworks, really, and just run through, and I will rattle through these slides fairly quickly because it's a sort of hydrology and soil mechanics, but hopefully of interest. Surface water is present, maybe present on the right hand side. I'm showing it coming down the hillside towards the embankment, but there will be water contained within the solid strata underneath. There may be some permeability in the rock, there may be some permeability in, for example, a sand and gravel layer in underlying the actual construction of the embankment itself. There will be perched water in the embankment, and there may even in clay embankments be water ponded or perched on the sort of dished core of a clay embankment. All of these water tables have an impact on the stability of the earthwork and the way that the earthwork and indeed the underlying soils behave. And it's really, really important that we manage this water, the water in the ground, as effectively as we manage the water on the surface as well. A little note on effective stress, because effective stress is a crucial concept. And what the concept tells us is that if you submerge a lump of rock underwater and you're holding it in your hand, it feels as though it weighs less. And that's because, like anything, it is being buoyed up by the water around it. The impact of this is that if you have a soil that is completely saturated, the particles inside it are buoyed up to a degree by the water around them, and therefore the forces acting, those little arrows, point-to-point contacts, apply less friction between the grains. So this concept of effective stress is really important because it's the friction, partly the friction, I'll come on to this in the next couple of slides, but in a granular soil, it is the frictional forces that hold the earthwork up. And if you reduce the strength of those frictional forces, you reduce the shear strength and you reduce the ability of the earthwork to stand up. So it's really important that water levels are managed if you want your earthworks to behave themselves. Let's just continue on. Cohesion, on the other hand, is a factor also, and this is the sort of surface tension effect, which is the sort of electrostatic attraction of the water to the soil particle. It's not very significant in large grained soil, so sands and gravels. And you'll notice when you're on a beach, if you're building a sandcastle, if the soil's damp, it stands vertical. That's the cohesion holding those sand grains together. But as it dries out, and as you lose that cohesion effect or the surface tension effect, the sand all starts to fall down. So it's not very significant in sand, but if you reduce the size of the grain sizes, and looking at the bottom picture there, to clays, actually it starts to become hugely significant because the surface area of a clay is massively greater. If you took all of the particles in the clay, the surface area is massively greater in a clay than it is in a gravel or a sand. And so if you have those electrostatic forces, the surface tension forces acting on the grains of that massive surface area, it is sufficient to hold the clay upright. And you'll see in some construction circumstances, clay faces will stand, boulder clay faces will stand vertical for you know, a year and a half, 2 years of construction, simply held in place by the cohesive forces, these cohesive forces provided by the electrostatic attraction and the surface tension forces of the water in those clays. You wouldn't find a sand face standing up in the same way because as it dried out, it would start to fall down. So it's a very water in soils affects them in a different way. Silts are a story all of their own. I probably won't get bogged down in that, but they have some very peculiar properties which can cause problems. Perhaps some of the longer serving P-way engineers or those used to civils construction will be familiar with the term cow belly in excavations, where effectively you feel your feet wobbling on the formation you're standing on. It's a bit similar to the effect you get on beaches, where you start to get the effect of quicksand. And that can have significant impact on any excavations because it causes a lot of instability in them. But let's not dwell on that too much. One other factor to note, and I mentioned this in regard to desiccation and shrinkage effects. The bottom picture on the right-hand side, water levels or water contents in clay soils do vary, but because a lot of support is being provided by the water, if you remove the water, what happens is that the platy minerals, those brown plates shown there in the picture, just move closer together, even though there is still water retained. And that leads to shrinkage at the surface. And that's a very significant effect where, for example, tree roots remove water from the pore spaces in clay soils in the summer. And if they remove the water, the volume of the soil reduces and you get shrinkage effects, which can lead to problems with track quality. So these slides will reappear throughout the course of the remainder of the presentation, but I don't want to dwell on it too much, as I say, because I am conscious that time will run away with me. Water, therefore, is inherent in having impacts on formation failure. We understand the issues and impacts of formation where you'll have cyclic loading, you'll have movements or the interfaces between ballast and formation, you'll have disturbance and loosening, reduction in shear strength, introduction of water, and a gradual and progressive deterioration in the quality of that interface, unless the water is properly managed away from it. It can be particularly bad if water is not managed in cohesive soils and silts, because the water cannot dissipate from the actual soil in the formation itself as easily as it can in a sand or a gravel. So sands and gravels generally are very good formation materials, but clays and silts we have to treat with a great deal of respect and make sure the water is carried away from the actual track bed construction itself, and that pathway is maintained, that gradient is maintained to the drain, either in the 6 foot or the cess, to ensure the water is carried away. Desiccation shrinkage I've mentioned leads to volume reduction. That's prevalent in clay soils. Rotational failure primarily happens in cohesive soils, and due to a reduction in effective stress, and I'll show some diagrams in a moment which illustrate this. Translational failures again can be silty cohesive or granular soils. Earth flow failures, typically silts and fine granular soils which flow when they get too wet. And washout failure is just straightforward, good old-fashioned erosion due to too much water. So just to illustrate those and what can go wrong, and I will whistle through these, a fine bit of formation treatment. Those of you who work on Northwest and Central route will may well recognise this location, but it will be a sight to send chills through the hearts of all decent P-way engineers and geotechnical engineers for that matter. But simply cyclic loading of poorly drained formation leading to a complete remolding and a complete reworking of the soils in the formation at this location. Not helped obviously by the fact there's a fast flowing stream on the left hand side and a permeable bank made of ballast which allows water to freely migrate across into the track. Desiccation shrinkage I talked about. Here we've got a loss of top and also a loss of track alignment. The track has moved across towards the trees on the right hand side, which are ash. They have removed moisture locally, and you'll see that the loss of track alignment is very local to the position of some very tall ash trees. Obviously, with the threat of ash dieback, it may not be a problem for much longer, but the prospect of a whole load of trees dying adjacent to the railway should fill us all with dread, because of course pretty soon we're in a position where they want to fall on the track. So let's not wish for the removal of ash trees too quickly. Again, I've talked about the desiccation. Let's just continue. In terms of rotational failures, this is the West Coast Main Line, again, some years ago at the Cheddington location. We did actually have trains running at 20 miles an hour across the top of this failure. Oh, the good old days. But this failure was actively moving, and again, as a consequence of poor drainage at the toe, a build-up of poor water pressures at the toe of the slope, elevated water in the embankment, high poor water pressures at the toe, an encouragement, a reduction in strength and an encouragement in movement at the toe, and eventual failure surface developing as a consequence. Again, poor drainage at the toe, not carrying that water away, allowing the failure to occur. As we carry on, this is a failure which occurred at Harbury Cutting. That's a name which may be familiar to many of you on the call, given that we were remediating the slope a couple of years after this failure occurred, and we had a massive failure which closed the DCL line for quite some time, the Chiltern Main Line. This failure type is quite particular to soils where shallow weathering occurs into what we call mud rocks, so mudstones and marls. Marls very common across the Cheshire area, for example. The soil deteriorates to a depth of about a metre, metre and a half in that sort of light grey layer. And then what happens is that the water, in torrential rainfall, water gets in through desiccation, cracking and fractures in that surface layer, and it sits on the interface between the intact natural ground, the mudstone underneath, and the weathered layer on top. The poor water pressures build up. Typically they would build up down at the toe here, and that weathered layer becomes weakened. There's reduced strength on the interface, and the whole lot slides down into the cutting and onto the railway below. So this is a failure typical of natural cutting slopes, and obviously can have a potentially serious impact on the safety of trains at the bottom. Again, principal effect of stress applies. This is an earthworks failure which occurred at Ubeck on the West Coast Main Line in 2005, and this is a classic earth flow failure. In earth flow failures, what happens is that a permeable layer, this light grey area here is a sand layer, and the dark grey layers are layers of clay. Water falling on the field above gets into the sand layer, and the water pressure builds. So the sand layer becomes saturated, the water table becomes elevated. At this toe location here, the water pressure exceeds the weight of the soil pressing down. As soon as the water pressure exceeds the weight of the soil pressing down, there is nothing stopping that soil from moving. So it just becomes liquefied and it pours down onto the track. And that's exactly what happened at Ubeck. Again, keen followers of earthworks failures, such as myself, will remember the site at Nethertown on the Cumbrian coastline. That was a very similar failure. A very serious rainfall event led to a failure of just this kind in a fluvio-glacial sand layer. Washout failures, as I mentioned, really just too much water reaching the railway, flowing over the top, eroding soils, and so the light grey or light brown soils at the top here are erodible. Surface water flows down, it washes away, and it just literally carries it down onto the track, and it accumulates across the debris, across the track. Just reflecting on the behaviour of these materials, quite often you'll go to a site like this, see a big pile of debris, and you can actually walk over it because the water has escaped. It's got out of the soil, the water has done its damage, and the water now has flowed out, disappeared into the drainage, drained away, and actually what you have is a pile of sand across the track. So interesting behaviours in soils of this kind. And in understanding the behaviour of these things, it's really important that we do get a good grasp on the geology, the topography in the area. And this is what the geotechnical teams do. The earthworks examination process tries to pick up on all of these factors to assign a hazard score to the earthworks, and then align those hazard scores with the consequence of failure at a particular location. Clearly high consequence on the line like the West Coast Main Line, rather than on a sort of minor freight route which may carry one train a day. And in that way, we are able to risk rank earthworks and to a degree also risk rank the drainage associated. But our drainage knowledge is nowhere near as good as our knowledge of earthworks. Well, you'll all be aware, so that's a primer in the behaviour of earthworks and behaviour of soils, and hopefully emphasises the importance of drainage and in managing the risks to not only the earthworks but also to track formation. Just want to say a few things about climate change, and again I'll have to whiz through these slides because I'm conscious time is running away. But we will all be aware, whatever our views of climate change impact, we should all be aware that there appears to be a greater increase in extremes in the weather we're experiencing. Now, it may be that if you averaged out weather conditions over 5 years, you would find one 5-year period was pretty much the same as another. But what we are seeing is actually consistent with the predictions for climate change, which is this increase in storminess and an increase in extremes in our weather conditions. I helped pull together the draft Weather Resilience and Climate Change Adaptation Plan for North West and Central Region. I really just gathered the technical information from the engineering teams and put some words around it. And all the clever stuff was done by the climate change team at Centre. But the predictions are that, and this is CP09 data, we have CP19 data, which is the sort of 2019 climate change prediction, which is broadly similar to the CP09 data. And it suggests that by the 2050s, peak temperatures could be up to 5.7, approximately 6 degrees higher than they are now. By the 2080s, potentially peak temperatures could be up as high as 8 degrees higher, with a 40 and 53% increases in rainfall, drier summers, wetter winters, but increased storminess, increased likelihood of extreme events in the summer as well as in the winter. Generally higher temperatures, but that doesn't mean you won't get severe cold snaps as well, but just fewer of them probably. All of these changes have been allowed for to a greater or lesser extent in our plans for CP6 on Northwest and Central, I should say W and C in top left-hand corner. From earthworks, there's a proposal to look at the greater risks of scour and manage better the increased failure risk due to desiccation for extended hot periods in the summers. For drainage and off-track, we have a lot of undercapacity drainage. Well, to be brutal, we don't actually know where any of our drainage is, and that's the first priority. But what we're aiming to do is improve resilience to extreme events during the course of the works that we do in CP6. Structures, again, greater focus on scour risk, improved coastal protection, and greater work on ice risk in tunnels for those fewer but more extreme ice events. For track, of course, big impact on stressing temperatures, making sure that our seasonal preparedness is done correctly, and obviously with increased storminess and greater flood risk, a greater likelihood of wet beds and formation problems where our drainage is not functioning effectively. So all of those things have been allowed for as part of business as usual within our plans for CP6, but we are also planning increased spend in a number of areas on earthworks, looking at soft rocks, for example, those ones which led to the failure at Harbury Cutting, subsidence and the impacts as a consequence of more water dissolving things like gypsum or causing collapse in voids underneath the ground, and addressing the backlog of track drainage and improving our approaches to vegetation management and that kind of thing. So how are we therefore looking at mitigating the risks of water as we enter into these periods of greater extremes? Well, we obviously have a set of standards. The extract on the right-hand side of this page here is the an extract from 005 standard, which is our drainage standard, you can just about make it out. But the table here dictates that on primary and secondary routes, high track category routes, we would expect to design our drainage to allow for the sort of storm that you'd get once every 50 years. On less trafficked routes, we'd be trying to manage the impacts of storms you'd expect perhaps once in every 25 years, so slightly less extreme than the 1 in 50. But we also have to make allowance for climate change impacts by adding by considering the impacts of 1 in 200-year events, and making sure that the systems are resilient to resist extreme events of that kind, even if the track flooded, for example. So these things are allowed for in the standards, and when we are delivering designs such as the one shown bottom right hand corner there, we are taking into account these and trying to build the level of sort of capability and capacity into the drainage as we're doing it. So that's our first measure in what we build. And the sorts of drainage I'm showing here, if you remember that flooding picture with the person standing by the side of the railway not wearing full PPE, Fenny Compton cutting, this is the main feeder at the crest, and we've built an attenuation system there to hold the water back at times of extreme flooding to prevent the sort of flooding that we saw. You know, similar locations, we're trying to build in adequate capacity into drainage systems, either formalizing drainage and making it more resilient, or putting in drainage where there was none before to try to manage the impacts. It's not always possible to design to the standards, and that's perhaps something that is a direct is something that needs to be directly mentioned in relation to the title of this talk, because it's all very well trying to design and manage for adverse weather, but you can't always afford to do it. It's not always possible to build that 500mm diameter pipe in the 6 foot where the 6 foot is tight to gauge. And so we have to take a view on that, because we may find that trying to install a larger diameter pipe, one which is capable of managing 1 in 50-year return storm in the 6 foot, is just not possible, and it doubles the cost of the job, and anyway the access isn't available. So there's a heavy dose of pragmatism involved, and we need to look for alternative solutions such as building attenuation schemes off-site. That brings its own problems, because landowners don't like selling their land, or if they do want to sell them, they want to sell them for a very substantial profit. And we have no rights of access, or very limited rights of access, to get in and insist on being able to do works. We're not like the power supply companies who have rights of access for maintenance. We don't have those. We have to negotiate every single access with adjacent landowners, and I think that's sometimes not appreciated by the general public. Where we do have issues, and we have identified critical assets which flood on a regular basis, we're trying to introduce systems which have necessarily a level of resilience to reduce flood risk. And this is part of our business as usual, with a nod towards compliance to the standards to ensure that these locations are resilient. So that's in design, and you know there will be elements of that included, I'm sure, in the track design standards, which I'm not so familiar with. When it comes to management of the risks associated with actual weather events, we have this weighty tome, standard 021, which really covers all of the things that we need to have as a region to manage weather effectively. It includes requirements for seasonal preparedness plans, and covers things like leaf fall and preparation for snow, making sure we've got the right processes and systems in place, and compliance with it is a major undertaking, which is why we have seasonal delivery specialists. What we also have is TRK 1010, which is more targeted at how we respond to extreme weather events, and how we put people out on track and at key locations, how we manage the inspection regime at times of extreme weather, and how it ties in also with the plans for other asset groups, so the geotechnical team and the structures team. And the geotechnical team developed, when I was leading the geotechnical team, we developed a plan for mitigation of risk associated with earthworks in adverse weather, and that involved us feeding into the 021 process and preparing a plan which enables us to anticipate where earthworks are at risk and where problems may occur, so that when an extreme weather action teleconference is called, we are able to provide clear guidance on those locations which we think are at risk, given the intensity of the storm. And we're obviously heavily reliant on good quality weather data. This is an extract from the Met Desk weather radar feed, but you'll see along the top of this screenshot here that there are a whole load of things provided for us in terms of weather, not just about rainfall, but temperature, wind speed. There are analytical tools, there are observation tools. So there's a huge amount of resource available to us to help us to judge what is going to happen. And this is an extract from the observation radar. It was downloaded real time. You'll see it was downloaded real time yesterday. But it does also include a prediction of what's going to happen to this band of rain, which was advancing over Scotland at the time. And that's extremely useful because it gives us the opportunity to look at predictions of rainfall based on the forecasts available at the time. And this will always be switched on as soon as what is called, so we can see what the predictions are. This, you may want to be aware, is the weather forecast. I think it's for Tuesday next week, which shows around about 48 mil of rainfall falling on the Pennines adjacent or just south of Manchester, so Peak District Pennines border, which, let me tell you, is a substantial amount of rainfall. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we have an EWAT called for this to manage the impacts. And what the tool allows us to do is take a forecast such as this and then look at whether we've breached critical thresholds. And these critical thresholds for rainfall in the middle here, and just zoom into that, show us that adverse level defined as being up to 20 to 25 mil of rainfall in a 12-hour period. Extreme rainfall is set as being 25 mil or more. Now these are levels that have been set centrally by the National Operating Centre, and they vary across the region. You know, we say this quite frequently, but actually 15 to 19 mil of rainfall in Cumbria is just a normal balmy day in Cumbria, whereas 15 to 20 mil of rainfall down in the plush lowlands of Oxfordshire or Berkshire is a serious amount of rain. So we need to manage this kind of rainfall and have techniques and processes of our own, and we need to interpret this data with a sensible and rational head and with appropriately qualified and experienced people. The other tool that we have here is the precipitation analysis tool. This is every single high consequence earthwork identified by the geotechnical team, and it shows us at a glance what the RAG status of that earthwork is going to be for the weather anticipated. We don't get to see the extreme rainfall I showed you on the previous slide because that's further over. It's on Tuesday next week. And actually conditions for the remainder of this week and into the weekend and early parts of next week look fairly benign. But were there a severe rainfall event forecast over the Cumbrian coastline, CBC1, these squares here would be turning orange and red. And we'd be looking at them and thinking, oh dear, we need to get some mitigation measures in place, whether that's track patrolling, watchmen, preemptive maintenance of drainage systems, and so on. And all of that that handle starts to crank and turn when an EWAT is called, and those processes start to happen. Just moving on. So those are the systems and processes we have in place. That is business as usual, if you like, and we've developed those. There have been key events and critical incidents which have developed and built our capability in those areas. And I just want to talk about those for a moment because, of course, at the back of everybody's mind will be the incident at Stonehaven and Carmont in the summer, a really tragic event which I'm sure will have had the same effect on all of you on this conference call that it had on me, which is a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. It is our worst case scenario as geotechnical and drainage engineers. I'm sure as any railway engineer, it is the worst case scenario anyway. But there have been a number of events that have attracted attention, and I am conscious of the time, so we'll have to go through this fairly quickly. We had a whole range of incidents in 2012-13, which were very prominent derailments. This led to a lot of scrutiny from the regulator and the establishment of a 10-point plan to start to address the issue of the impacts of adverse weather and excess water on the earthwork assets, because there were a very large number of derailments in a short space of time. We got an improvement notice because we were not felt to be moving quickly enough after that period of 12-13, and the 10-point plan was not being put in place quickly enough. So we were told that we were not able to demonstrate effective management of risks arising from drainage systems leading to landslip, and we were failing to ensure that persons not in our employment were not exposed to risk for health and safety. This led to the production of a list of critical drainage assets, and we have been managing those assets since then, with a series of mitigations in place, which are an enhanced quarterly inspection regime at those sites identified as being critical, so that we can determine whether or not they are deteriorating and what the condition of the drainage is at those sites. But it was very much a sticking plaster, if I'm honest, and the actions put in place and undertaken by the maintenance organisation really are a holding measure whilst we try to get our act together in terms of asset knowledge and delivery of improvement to drainage assets at those locations and improvement to the earthwork quality. That's all very well, but then Watford happened. Watford brought renewed vigour and renewed scrutiny from the regulator to our management of surface water runoff. This is a washout stroke earth flow stroke translational failure. Chalk does not behave like soils that I described earlier. It's a soft rock, but the volume of water flowing off the adjacent Warner Brothers film lot was of a size and volume that it just washed the material down. In our defence, we were repairing the slope at the time, but unfortunately it did derail a train, and we were really, really fortunate not to have a serious incident. So this brought even more scrutiny from the regulator. Their recommendations were that we needed to get to grips with our drainage data capture programme, as well as the critical drainage asset locations. They introduced a requirement to inspect critical tunnel portal sites, and then ultimately they wanted us to continue to do a thorough inspection of the drainage at all tunnel portals. That's 434 tunnel portals on North Western Central Route alone. So a major undertaking, lots of pressure being applied. Out of the Watford event, we said, well, we need to get better at predicting these sudden storm events that lead to that volume of rainfall falling. So we proposed a system to MetDesk where, well, I think it was MetDesk at the time, whereby they would be able to track the advance of significant storm events towards the railway and give us an alert. And we also started to introduce blanket speed restrictions when we had a forecast of rain exceeding particular thresholds, and more on that in due course. And I will have to whistle through this. Drainage data capture, we're making really good progress in picking up really good quality data. This is on the Skipton Wellington branch, and this is quality drainage data now that we're getting with full information about the assets themselves. You'll see in this picture we have an asset recorded where a catch pit is present in the cess. We have all the details of that catch pit. We know what size it is, we know what pipes flow into it, we know what direction the water flows out of it. So we're building really good quality data, but it is a slow process, and that's in response to direct pressure from the regulator, even though it's something we knew we had to do. So we are taking steps in that direction, and more information about the drainage data capture programme there. But then Stonehaven. And this has really been another one of those, if we thought we had pressure before from Watford, we have seen a further seismic shift in the amount of pressure being applied now to our management of drainage and earthworks as a consequence of this. North Western Central have produced a 9-point plan. This involves immediate inspection of sites similar to those at Stonehaven, a review of the extreme weather plans, looking at technology and solutions for tracking those storm events. You remember that diagram I just showed you with the rectangles of different colors in? Let's get that in place. We need to do it. We need it because this was a convective storm event that happened suddenly, caused a massive impact on the railway. We need that kind of technology to track now. We need to improve our alerting system, so we need to be looking at monitoring systems with a renewed vigor. That's something that's been bubbling along in the background for quite a while, and we've really not got to the point where we've got effective, cost-effective monitoring of earthworks assets. We've also got £15 million worth of funding to plough into critical and high-risk drainage and earthwork locations. We're looking at doing some research studies as well, and building a program of works there to deliver at those sort of high risk, high impact locations. Accelerating the delivery of the drainage surveys. The aim was to complete by year 4 of CP6. We're now looking to push for that completion by year 3. And then what can we do better to manage our response to incidents of the kind that caused the failure at Stonehaven? We have had a couple of incidents recently, one at Whitmore on the West Coast Main Line in particular, where a train ran through debris on the track. That was a similar convective, sudden summer storm event, and we again got away with it on that occasion, and that's just not good enough. Coming out of Carmont, you'll see here a screenshot from our standards website. Look at the amount of red on here. These are all standards that have been changed since June. As a direct response to the incident at Stonehaven and the improvements required in our management of incidents, our incident response, and our weather management processes. So there's a lot of activity going on there, changing the way we manage incidents and the way we approach our response to incidents of that kind. We've developed our own process to try and manage the impacts better, to better predict the impacts of rainfall, to provide some certainty rather than relying on somebody knowledgeable in an EWAT or extreme weather action teleconference call saying, I think you should impose a speed restriction. We need to get a little bit more rigor around it. So what we've done is we've set our own thresholds. If you remember, I talked about thresholds set nationally by the National Operating Centre. We've set our own thresholds now on North West and Central. And if we exceed these thresholds, we are immediately considering the implementation of a blanket emergency speed restrictions. And that's always a hotly contested topic because of course, as soon as you impose a blanket speed restriction, you cripple performance and you reduce the amount of trains that can run. Just conscious of the time, I do need to push through this fairly quickly, so apologies if I'm rushing these last few slides. I talked about this system here. There is a thing called Nowcasting, which, based on the overlay of multiple forecast tools, enables the meteorological office and other weather systems and setups to track storms and predict where they will fall. We would love to implement this because if you imagine a length of railway running through the red and pink zone there, Nowcasting would enable us to real-time predict at what point the storm was going to hit the railway and give a level of probability as to which bit of the railway it hit first. That would help us with our immediate responses to these kind of storm events. So that's something that we need to be looking at actively, and we are in active discussion with the Met Office as a direct consequence of the Stonehaven events to look and see if we can introduce that. One of the things that Carmont derailment location brings to our attention is this area of hillside sloping down to a concentration feature at this site here. We need to be looking at the catchments adjacent to the railway, not just at Carmont, Stonehaven, but at all the other locations on the network. So we need to be modelling catchment areas adjacent to the railway to identify those locations where the topography is such that water will be concentrated if you have extreme weather, and enable us to risk rank locations on the basis of the catchment adjacent and give ourselves a chance of prioritizing those sites for treatment. You know, at this location, which is Whitmore Cutting, where the failure occurred, the water concentrated at one point. We should have had effective drainage at that location, but we didn't. So, and that is common to a lot of locations on the railway. So we need to be able to have the right sorts of tools which enable us to focus and target on these sites. So that is another big area where we need to invest over the next 2 to 3 years in feasibility and also into CP7. Using techniques such as surface water flow mapping, we can pick up on concentration features. This is the 1 in 100-year flood event, shows water concentrated at these sites. That gives us a lot of clues as to how to improve the drainage assets that we have there to build greater resilience. So it's another means of identifying locations where we get concentration. And also there's a lot we can do in remote condition monitoring with the installation of cameras at critical locations. Now the P-Way team don't need to go out to site to see whether it's functioning effectively, because they can look at the middle picture or see the middle picture and assess that there is no problem. But as soon as they see the picture on the bottom there, they know they've got to hop in their vans, get out there and start clearing debris. So it really enables us to remote condition monitoring enables us to dispose people to the right location in an efficient way. And finally, some technologies such as automated trash screens, necessary at locations where there's a high debris load. This would just remove the risk of flooding at critical locations, and this is technology we need to be looking at as well. We are installing weather stations. We've got 60 going in across the network. They're good for analysing events after the event. They're not so good necessarily for predicting, but they do provide us with additional data. And just to finish up, really, we need to be just better at surveying, maintaining, monitoring, improving our drainage asset knowledge, building a greater whole system understanding so we can target at the in the most cost-effective way. We need to be understanding what brings the greatest benefit for performance and safety risk, as well as financial risk and others. And we need to be tying it in with our management of vegetation to prevent desiccation impacts and so on. We also need to be doing all of this with an eye on climate change to build the resilience of the railway. And now we've got COVID to think about. And what impact is that going to have? I think that's probably the topic of another talk, to be honest, and I'm conscious I've probably run over by at least 10 minutes, so it's probably better if I leave it there. But hopefully that's given you an indication of the sorts of things that sorts of impacts the weather has, and the sort of systems and processes we have in place, and the things we're trying to do to build capability and build resilience against its impacts as we move forward. And that'll certainly be a substantial part of my planning for CP7. To make sure that we get the right levels of funding available, all dependent on what happens with COVID, as I've mentioned. So that's me done. So if I stop sharing now, I can pass back.
Okay.